cool. It feels like we're ready to go, huh?
Sure.
I think so.
Like we got all the.
I forgot all the talking points immediately.
That's why we wrote them on that whiteboard.
They're right there.
Do you need to?
took
I
pictures.
took a
Like,
picture
just
of
lean
them.
back.
I took a picture of them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, there's Goldberger.
She's flying into Ontario. Where?
California.
California.
Ontario, California. Our favorite.
It's a real place, Jason.
I know it is. It's just real confusing when you're like, they called Canada a state, so then you're like, wait a second, it's a real place.
Yeah, it's not a state. It's a real
No,
place.
It tripped up the Merc guys.
A lot of stuff moves
us.
through there. Yeah. All right. Yeah, we should probably. Well, I've got buttons to press over here. We should probably get going. I would
Yep.
say.
Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah. Hey,
Yes.
theme music. Got to.
1980s workplace comedy.
That production quality.
That needs to be the footage. Wait, so is that what
Oh yeah.
Oh.
I think it looks a little better on Crumm's end.
Oh, it's white.
I think it's wider. Yeah.
Okay.
A little bit. I think we've got
Okay,
it.
am I in frame,
Yeah,
Crumm,
what can
for
you
you?
see?
Yeah, I was able to enlarge.
We're
the
getting it
video
together. We're getting it together. A lot of moving parts here, but we're okay. I want to thank everybody for joining me here for this meeting of the Anti-JavaScript Club. really appreciate it. Local
We have
chapter.
stickers.
We got merch. It's coming. Yeah, we wanted to. We just had a big summit. We're kind of on the tail end. It was a great time. Good time was had by all, I feel like. And before everybody headed out back to our respective areas of the country, wanted to get some of the engineering team together to talk about some technologies that we're using, particularly on the front end side, right? And put a spotlight on you all a little bit, because the rest of the show is probably going to be me and Rich and very like supply chain kind of stuff. But you know, the opportunities for us to all get together in one place are few and far between. Sorry, Crumm couldn't make it. That's a super bummer. We
was.
we can unpack that a little bit. But yeah, I want to actually turn it over to Ben here to introduce the team we have assembled, and we'll go from there.
All right. Yeah, we've got Billy Lanchantin, who's a principal engineer at CargoSense, Sara Flemming, who's our lead UI UX developer, and Mike Crumm, another principal engineer here at CargoSense. And me, I'm the CTO, and we're in some sense talking about how we supply software. See what I did there? I'm so sorry. To
We're part of the chain.
the end users. And yeah, specifically a tech called LiveView. So I'll just give most of this is going to be pretty inside baseball on LiveView, but I will talk just a little bit about how we started using it and in that way a tiny bit about what it is. So we've been around as a company for a while, and a lot of the first user interfaces we were giving to people were following, I think a really common practice at the time to deliver really rich user interfaces, which was you have a server with an API, which we were first a lot of REST APIs and then eventually GraphQL. And then you had JavaScript and lots and lots and lots of JavaScript that would sort of build this front-end application to do what you wanted to do for the users. And we'd done many iterations of those. I'd say in the first 6 or 7 years here, we touched, 5 different front-end frameworks, because that's what you did in the teens of this millennia. And
He said, as if it weren't still completely commonplace.
yeah, nobody is still rewriting their JavaScripts in latest flavor of the day apps at all.
Absolutely not.
Right.
And so somewhere along the line, we were a pretty small team, and we'd had some of our JavaScript folks decided to join a different company, and we were looking at building some new stuff, and we had us Elixir folks. And what we were trying to decide is, are we investing in yet another front-end framework for this new project, or do we have new options? And so Elixir is this programming language that we use. It's got a framework called Phoenix that we've been using for APIs. It's great. It's been on getting a bunch of press lately, actually, on Hacker News and that kind of thing. And I was chatting about all this with one of the Phoenix creators, and he's like, so I've got this insane project that you should look at. And it's where we basically just have the server ship HTML over a WebSocket. And then when you want to change that HTML, you just re-render it on the server and you ship new HTML. And instead of all that JavaScript nonsense, we have just a tiny bit of JavaScript to do the patching on the client, but you just kind of have a server side front end, but done on the server side. It's like, that sounds great. So we started using it. It wasn't even public yet. And here we are 4 or 5 years later. And basically all our stuff is using it. It has been very good. It's also undergone enormous change in that time. So we've got, I think, lots of different experiences, different levels of familiarity with both LiveView, JavaScript, Elixir. And that's the stack that we got.
So, because I think you guys were just starting to kind of not experiment, but like build actual stuff that we were shipping to customers with LiveView around the time that I joined, which is like 4 years ago now. So that tracks.
Yeah, we had the first. We'd built like a pet tracking thing.
Yeah,
and we went and talked to a customer, and that we were just incidentally showing them this, and they're like, "Oh my God, can you build that for our freight?" And we're like, okay, sure. So, I went home and spent 2 weeks, and we're doing some because of this evolution of the company, we're doing some unusual things with LiveView. So a lot of folks, especially if you just like go Google LiveView and you like do the tutorial, you'll see something where you're building like a full stack Phoenix app where it's got like a connection to a database, it's got your application logic, and then it's got these LiveView layer, and you're like talking directly to the database. We had this giant GraphQL API that had held these capabilities, and we were trying to build on top of that. So we're in this weird place about building like a UI from scratch that is on the server, but it's making like these API calls. And so we had the first version of this in like 2 weeks, and then we had it like live updating with subscriptions in like another 3 days. I'll talk more about that later, but it was a cool experience to get going. And it just has kind of like blossomed from there.
Yeah. So Mike, you're a core member, or you're a core contributor, right? I'm not sure the exact term, and you're heavily involved in the build out of LiveView itself. Take us through how you got involved with Phoenix and you got like kind of involved heavily on this side of the framework.
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, I am a member of the Phoenix core team. So I've done several contributions to the framework itself, and then LiveView quite a bit in a couple of, well, kind of all over the place, but a couple of specific areas I've dug really deep into. But I was invited to join the core team in late 2019. I think I was working at Dockyard and had been doing work for one of their clients, and was super heavy LiveView project. And so when you're in it every day, in a especially when it's a brand new sort of framework that's coming into being, you find a lot of issues just as you're building the thing. So I was fixing bugs. I was contributing new features as we needed them for pages we were building out in the app as we were doing those different things. And so, yeah, Chris McCord, the creator of Phoenix, asked, he's like, "Hey, you're really in the thick of it. Would you like to sort of do that officially?" And I said, "Yeah, that'd be fantastic. Thank you so much." So, and it's really not that. I mean, being on the core team, contribution wise, isn't super different from not being on the core team. Just in the sense that anyone can contribute, obviously, to the framework. And if you want to dive, all you have to do really to be a heavy contributor is dive deep into the source code and figure out how it works. And do it. Yeah, absolutely. So, and most of that, for me, certainly comes out of necessity. It's more, I find that the things that it's easier to get things done if they are like work adjacent. So if there's something I needed for a page or a feature that we needed for an app, then that stuff kind of is easier to find time to work on and get done.
Modals.
So Yeah, that's a good example. Yeah, so I had done that, and then what was the first thing I started working on? One of the main things when I actually started a little bit before I joined the core team was there had been a lot of talk, I guess, in the community, or at least within the Phoenix team, about building a dashboard tool, like having something that could ship with the framework that was sort of gave you some real time information about your application, and so it was kind of funny. I was asked to come to a meeting to talk about it, and Chris had asked me to join, and then he was sick that day, so it was just me on a Zoom call with the rest of the Phoenix core team, including like Jose Valim, the creator of Elixir, and we were talking through the dashboard stuff, and then as we kind of got deeper into it, Jose asked me, he's like, "So do you want to build it?" I said, Sure. Yeah, that sounds great. I'll have a million questions, but yes, I would like to do that. So I started working on that, and we shipped it about 6 months later, and that was one of my larger projects that was LiveView related. And funnily enough, when we initially started talking about it, we weren't going to build it as a LiveView app. Like that initially had started out, we were just going to write some JavaScript for the front end, and at some point, I said to them, if we don't write this in LiveView, they're going to call us hypocrites. And they, kind of thought about it for a minute and said, yeah, you're probably right. So let's see, what would it look like if we did it in LiveView? So that's what we did, and I definitely think it was the right move, because we almost immediately started getting a ton of contributions from the rest of the community, because they were able to jump in. It was code that they were familiar with. It was LiveView code. It wasn't again, some other JavaScript thing that you had to go dig in and learn, which I think is one of the reasons for a little bit there, we got more, deeper contributions, not necessarily more quantity, but certainly, in quality higher, or just larger feature sets to the dashboard than we ever do to LiveView, because LiveView is it's a very large JavaScript. Well, it's not large. It's not that large, I guess, but it's a big JavaScript application. There's a lot going on the client.
You're telling me that browsers are not these perfectly consistent applications that you can just write patch the DOM please, and it works great. You have to worry about it.
That is what I'm telling you. That's exactly what I'm saying, Ben. Yes, that funnily enough, you have to care about all of the places where the client code runs, and as much as we'd like it that they were all the same, they aren't.
Yeah. So that being kind of like an early example of you kind of dog fooding this and putting this something it was kind of an interesting way of exposing everyone building Phoenix apps to a LiveView thing in a concrete example, right? Where it's and that kind of helps snowball. I want to ask, were we one of the first companies outside, I guess, Dockyard to start building actual things?
We had, I don't think I'll get in trouble saying this, we had access to the repo before it was public, so probably
Almost certainly, yeah.
Yeah. Not a okay.
0.1 dot whatever. So yeah,
pretty early.
Yeah.
What are we on now? Is it
what
something?
Where is it now, and what do you guys have any idea what the usage is like, and how many things are out there that are? No,
I don't know for sure.
Yeah.
I know of several companies that are using LiveView. Certainly using Phoenix in production. I know at least a few that are using LiveView in production. So Cars.com comes to mind. They've been pretty vocal about their use of LiveView on there for their search results page, and for quite a bit of back-end tooling, I think, as well. Spotify is using it for some internal tooling stuff. The question is always public site, who's using it out in the open, and I think we're probably one of the larger ones.
Right on.
Phoenix just won most admired framework 2 years running on the Stack Overflow survey.
Not bad.
Yeah. So, and I'm sure LiveView is a major contributor to that. And I think the other thing that speaks to LiveView's success is all of the immediate imitations. LiveView is not the first framework to try to do this back end as the front end approach, and obviously React Native kind of almost going the other direction, taking something very front end and doing it on the server. But PHP Laravel came out with what is that? What is theirs called?
Is that Hotwire?
Yeah,
or is that the other
LiveWire.
one? LiveWire.
LiveWire is the one that works for Laravel, and then
Rails has one
as well.
Yeah. And it's the same. It's a similar idea, but obviously they're missing some of that secret sauce, right? Is the Beam? You get your one process. That has lots of perks.
Is it all perks? Is it all upside? Or what? I guess what are some challenges that we've run into with LiveView? I know there are very little regrets. I think the approach is working out for us quite well, but.
I would say like from a runtime standpoint, not a lot of snags. It can one of the early challenges but then LiveView came up with a pretty good answer to this was form recovery. So we do like blue-green deployments. We like those deployments to happen kind of at any point. We don't like having to have like the scheduled deployment hour where we might just break everyone's page. We like that to be as smooth as possible. And in very early versions of LiveView, in all versions, if you have like a form and when people are entering information into that form, that data is going to like go to your Elixir process that is managing that page, and it's going to be doing validations, maybe giving you some errors or other feedback.
Sure.
And when you deploy, that process goes away. And so in really early versions, your form would just like reset because the JavaScript would notice that the connection died. It would get you a new connection, which would connect you to the new server. But it doesn't know the first thing about your form content, and so it just goes away. And that's not a good UX. So that was a really early issue, I think in 0.4, if I'm going off memory here, which is incredibly dangerous and probably wrong. Chris shipped automatic form recovery, which basically then when the process goes away and then you get a new process, and the JavaScript knows that you have a form and it knows that you have like stuff in that form. And so what it will do is it gets the new connection and the new render from the server, but then it says, I'm not going to render that yet. I'm going to tell the server about what's inside this form. And then the server will like get that message, do a totally normal render. It doesn't have to know this is a form recovery. It doesn't know anything. It just goes like, oh, there's actually stuff in that form. It re-renders and then sends that up to the client. And then the client can be like, okay, cool. I will now render this now that the server has like acknowledged what the user has entered. And it just kind of like invisibly works an incredibly huge percentage of the time. And so that was like the only kind of operational thing that we've run into. There's a lot of ergonomics. Like we're talking about forms probably for we could talk about forms the entire rest of this because we write a lot of forms. We're a complicated business with complicated data, complicated user workflows, and we are almost to a fault committed to trying to make many of those workflows as easy for the users as possible, even if it makes for very complicated workflows. And so, the form patterns that existed for like simple CRUD apps where you click submit and it does an HTTP post and then you get your response back, those have not transliterated very well into the LiveView space. It's in a better spot today than it has been, but that's been a huge pain point, evolution with some pain along the way, I would say. I don't know. And like, this is your first framework, Billy, like your first front end framework in some sense. But I also know that you've been banging your head against the forms a fair bit.
Yeah, I'm just happy to be here. I don't know what I'm talking about, but they let me on the mic, so I'm gonna talk stuff. I think forms were definitely my axe to grind for a long time because I was like doing a front end framework for the first time. They're like, oh yeah, we need this. We need a way for them to input this thing into our system. Can you go build this form? And I'll start to do it, and I'm like learning change sets at the time, which is like a thing in regular Phoenix. It's not just specific to LiveView. And I'm trying to do stuff, and I'm just like, I don't understand how you can make this work in LiveView. It just kind of breaks, and I don't understand what I'm supposed to do. I would go to Ben, and he'd be like, oh yeah, that's actually hard. Wait, how do you do this? And it's been a lot of that. I don't know how into the particulars we want to get.
I'm sure we'll get into them in a minute, but yeah, that's probably like a high level one. And other than that, though, what other like major? I mean, the problem with asking Crumm about what things are tricky with LiveView is that like I get to live in this beautiful universe where Mike has largely paved over almost everything that like is a problem.
It's like how much time you got.
And Mike's
right?
like, dude, so Safari and drop downs. Like he knows the words.
Oh my gosh, I love when Mike will just come in and like, "Hey, do you understand that the browser spec? It's just like it's this chain of dependencies, and no one knows what the thing actually is. I just want to upload a file.
It's
Just.
Just
right. Well, all the time, and and sometimes it's like I just want to render a drop down, and I swear if we can't put just in that sentence, I don't know what we're doing.
Right.
And so, but it actually becomes it becomes very difficult sometimes when you're trying to mix. Problem is I know too much. Like that's where when you talk to me, I'll start talking about the what's happening under the hood, and when you start talking about how you make the sausage, then nobody wants to really have that conversation. Everybody just wants it to work. And that would be great if it were true. There are quirks, there are little idiosyncrasies that become problematic, and since forms have existed forever, and really, if you're doing anything interactive on the internet, you are likely interfacing with a form element of some kind.
Yeah.
Or you ought to be anyway.
Well, sure. That's a yes. That's a whole other.
That's a whole other discussion, but yeah.
Depending on who you're talking to, yeah, whether you want to use the form the way it was originally used.
yeah, that's actually funny.
So they've.
I was going to say,
please.
LiveView actually gives you a way to avoid that if you want to, because like with click events and stuff, you can make anything interactive.
Yeah, there's
Oh, right.
there are some fun some fun demos of just like browser heresy or whatever, where you just sort of by the time you have a server that can, a lot of this stuff gets abstracted away at some point. At the end of the day, if you have a key value structure that your Elixir code can make sense of, that's fine, and then you can do all kinds of shenanigans to give like some kind of key value structure back to that. None of them tend to be better. I mean, some of these browser specs exist for a reason. You get better usability, you get better, and actually, I think say that's one of the areas where LiveView has done really well is by actually the developers of LiveView, I feel like have shown remarkable restraint as far as like inventing insane new ways to abuse the DOM, and so that means that
Like a sport in other frameworks, right? Like,
That's, we get a decent number of questions, especially like in the Elixir Slack, in the Phoenix channel, where folks will come in and be like, why do I need a form element? Why can't this input just change? And I mean, spoiler alert, like you can just put a change event on an input now and sort of just work with that input, but it's still more restricted than it would be in, say, something like React. But the reason is because that's how, when we're being snarky, the answer is because that's how the internet works, right? But the truth is because like that is what the spec wants, right? Inputs don't really make sense outside of a form element. So DOM hierarchically, that's the way it's supposed to be, quote unquote. And it's because it's existed for so long. Like if you take the evolution of form UI is wild, because if you can take JavaScript all the way out of it, and the way you would do it in I think like Django shipped it this way out of the box in Python was to do where you would have a checkbox at the bottom of your form if you wanted to add another field. So say you're building a table UI that's going to have whatever name, address, email, and you want to add another row, there'd be a checkbox, save and add another, right? And then you'd hit next, and it would do a form post, and you'd have all the data plus that little metadata. They want to add another one. So when you render it the next time, you get an empty row, right? And Phoenix would do the same thing. So that requires no JavaScript whatsoever, and you can have some amount of like append, prepend, whatever you would want to put in. And then come along, React or even just vanilla JavaScript. And now instead of a checkbox and a full form post, I can add a button, right? Add another row, and it's going to inject some new HTML elements into the page, and then I can fill those out. Well, when we want to do, a similar thing, but when we're trying to keep all that state on the server,
Sure.
that becomes a little bit more complicated of a prospect, right? You can't just add some elements to the page. You need to tell the server that you want to render another row, and so dynamic things end up getting kind of tricky. But they were tricky everywhere. So I would argue that like we while it took some time to get the dynamic stuff really understood, within the context of what a live form needs, to operate, I think it's about there, and some of that within the more recent LiveView updates have added some of the abilities to handle those scenarios now in a much more elegant way than we were doing it before.
Yeah, Mike, are you talking about the new options on embeds? It was like index and sort position or something.
Yes, yeah, which I haven't actually had a chance to play with, but Chris McCord's most recent keynote kind of goes into, he built a demo app, kind of like a to-do list sort of project, like Kanban board kind of app to illustrate some of those dynamic features. And yeah, it's significantly smoother than it would have been previously, because they, handling things like sorting or removing elements, whether those elements, exist already or are new things you're wanting to add, maintaining IDs as you go through that whole process and making all of that make sense seems to be much easier to do now. So I'm actually looking forward to, revisiting some of our more complex forms, seeing how we can utilize that and make our lives easier moving forward.
Where was this 2 years ago?
Yeah.
Well, I want to hear from Sara some, because I think,
God.
because we haven't heard much from you yet, but
Yeah.
also I think you're probably, you've been writing front ends longer than all of us.
Yeah.
And I'd be interested to hear your experience, what like LiveView means in your workflow as basically our front end team of one here. I know when I first got exposed to this, I was like, this is a total game changer.
Yeah.
And so I want to.
It's been good. It's been it's probably the best framework that I've used in terms of having split screen with my editor on one side and the browser on the other, and the live reloading is maybe not a huge feature for other front end developers, or other developers at all, but it's been huge for me because I can make tiny changes or dump we were talking about this earlier. I still get the vocabulary mixed up because I spent so long in Ruby and Rails, but basically dump entire models to the front end so I can see what I have. And the speed at which I get results and answers back is the best of any of the frameworks I've worked in. And I think the background in Ruby on Rails made the transition into LiveView a little bit easier, but it also made it a little harder because the vocabulary is different.
Sure.
I'm constantly, even 3+ years in, asking questions about things that don't exist in LiveView, and Mike gets the brunt of that. Billy and Ben used to get the brunt of that, but now it's Mike. But it's being in it for just these couple of years. At this point, it makes the most sense to me in terms of building a fairly modern and data-heavy and complex set of views and workflows. It's the easiest one that I've ever worked with. So, and it feels less dangerous when I go in to, like, I can see, Mike knows, he's watched me do it. I can see where, see where the data queries are and just change things. And I may break my own environment, but I'm not messing with anybody else's. Not that that's not true in others, but it's the least, or maybe it's the most forgiving. It's the most permissive about doing that kind of stuff, get pretty immediate feedback. And usually, I'm not going to say usually, I'm going to say 50% of the time, the errors are sensible enough to somebody who isn't a backend developer,
Sure.
hasn't ever been one. And then the other 50% of the time, it's an escalation game. So I either search our Slack history because I've probably asked the question before, or if Mike's not around and Billy's busy, I'll ask Ben, or any combination thereof.
Yeah.
It helps to have like the people who've been using it since before it was released to the public available to ask questions. But otherwise it's pretty permissive. So at least from that side, it's good. The documentation is less friendly to a front end developer.
It's
It's been really, really hard. I think everybody here has been subject to how mad it's made me and how frustrated I've been with I am not the audience for like hex docs or I think that's just the domain. I don't think that's what they're actually called, but you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I am not the audience for that, and that makes it hard. So I have lots of when the documentation says this, what it actually means is this.
Yeah,
Sure.
tiny
In my
little
notes.
tangent. I had the exact same experience coming into Elixir. I was first reading the docs like 4 years ago, whenever I started writing Elixir, and it became very clear that it was written for like ex-Rubyists that had a bunch of pre-knowledge, and so they would just like there'd be a lot of assumed stuff. It's like, oh yeah, you know how you normally like give the form inputs a special name, and it's got this like bracket syntax. You know how that works, and I'm like, what is this? I've never seen this before. And so I'd have to come to like Ben. He'd be like, oh yeah, this is like actually I don't know where this came from, but like it works like this. So there's some there's an audience that the Elixir docs tend to assume they're talking to that they may not always be talking to. And I don't want to say like I think documentation is actually something that the Elixir community is really good at. It's like a first-class citizen in the language, and people the quality of documentation does tend to be really good. But yeah, there is a tendency to assume you're sort of like an expert in something else and not like a true green like beginner person.
Yeah, that's. I'm optimistic that with LiveView's appeal for some of the JavaScript developers and with the machine learning stuff that Jose is sort of single-handedly spearheading in an unbelievable pace, and therefore the Python developers and to some extent our developers that it's attracting. I'm hopeful that like that greater diversity in backgrounds will improve a lot of these docs because you're absolutely right. You have a whole lot of folks. I mean, the genesis of the language was Rubyists who were tired of the Ruby runtime in a lot of ways, and they've Chris and Jose both, and therefore many others in the community who take after them have newer developers in mind. There is like an explicit effort to try to write things in a way that is accessible to them, but there is no getting around the bit where they've been doing this for decades, and so you just can't write it for
burden of
true
knowledge,
novices all the time.
Well, and that style of writing is kind of annoying for somebody that does know all this stuff because they're like they'd have to skim and like, okay, I know all this. Get to the part that I actually need, and so there's always going to be a tension there, I think. And so I don't want to say that they didn't do a good job and it's really easy. They could have. It's a hard thing to do.
Well, in LiveView itself, I'm glad they have been open to ongoing change to keep making it better. But it has also meant that like. I can't tell you how many forum posts I've answered that were like, yeah, that tutorial is out of date.
All of them? Is it all of them?
Well,
It's many of them. Even the documentation, it's because we're on version like 18 or something. And
19.
It'll be like, or
0.19.
Shoot, I missed it. But yeah, it'll come in like, that's actually the old way you do stuff. We missed this one little edit. And
there are core components now.
Yeah. Very early on, when I was working on a contract project and LiveView was still pretty new, I would say to folks, sometimes they'd ask questions like, have you read the docs? And they'd be like, well, yeah, I read this one. No. Have you read all of the docs? Because that's like, but at the time I felt totally fine saying that because it was like 2 module docs and like it was like 2 pages. They were long, but it was like 2 pages. And if you read all of them, most of your questions could be answered. There's a lot more going on now
Slightly
than
more
there
than
was
2.
Yeah.
when I was saying that. So it's the weirdest thing about Elixir documentation. I think this is not just true of LiveView, but across the board, that folks either absolutely love it or they can't stand it. And like anecdotally, I hear more people liking it than hating it, but the people who have a hard time with the documentation there just are like, it's very much not working for them. And I want to figure out how to solve that problem in some kind of way. But it is, I think it does suffer from what Billy was talking about. There was sort of what as I was thinking about it, was sort of the if you know, you know kind of problem. Because if the docs are, if you know, and then the information that's there will help you. If you don't know at all, it's hard to figure out where you're supposed to be.
Yeah. I do wonder if there's like part of that. And this is a little bit of a tangent, but I do wonder if
tangents are okay.
Tangent on a podcast.
Wow.
What are you doing?
like many years ago at this point, Hex, like the Elixir XDoc, the library that generates this docs, ended up on HexDocs. added an affordance for not just having like module and function docs, which tend to really promote this very reference manual style of documentation. They added the ability to have guides or like pages, which people tend to use for guides, which are like just big markdown files. And that can be very good.
Yeah.
But what ends up happening almost universally, and this part is great, but it's missing the other half, I think, is that in your guides, you can like make a reference to a function, and then that becomes a clickable link that can just like pop you over to that function. And that's great when you're like reading the guides and you need, the guides will not show you every option that can be passed to that function.
Right.
You might click in to see that. Almost nobody puts links the other direction. So like maybe you're inside of fresh generated Phoenix app. You might not know, maybe you know Elixir a little bit, you don't know Phoenix at all. You have all these functions you see. VS Code, you get the Elixir LS plugin, so you can see the docs for that function right there.
Right.
But like you have no concept to understand like when am I supposed to be using this? When should I be reaching for this tool? The reference content is unhelpful to you.
Yeah.
I wonder if either through just a thing we ought to suggest library authors do, or if there's maybe something more structured that we could do where it's sort of like, hey, these functions or this module is like covered over in this guide over here. And it kind of like help take people who end up in the reference docs just by clicking through various things, kind of get back up to something that could like help you get your bearings, because that is really hard. And LiveView is going to have this problem for a long time, because even once it has matured to the point where like the if you Google a LiveView thing, you'll get an up-to-date blog or something. Even once we're at that point, there's still just like a lot of friggin' functions that you will end up calling in your LiveViews, and figuring out when and how to use that stuff is way more complicated than other things. Like if you look at the enum docs, which is the Elixir's basic Illuminator, I want to map something, filter something, that everyone gets. I have a collection. I would like to transform that collection in some way.
Right.
You can kind of just like wander through that module and everything's fine. But like, hey, here's the doc on like a live upload thing. You need to go read the whole live upload guide. Like you're not going to just look at that and know what you are doing.
And then probably copy pasta the example code, and then figure out what it's doing, and then make the necessary changes for your thing. And yeah.
Yeah, there are definitely levels of, you were talking about, documentation being a first-class citizen, but there are still levels to that. You have, even just the reference manual is better than what lots of languages had before, which was nothing. But the how and when, and maybe a little bit of the why. Obviously, literally every application is different. Every company is going to use it differently. I'm sure the ways in which we are using the entire stack wouldn't work for anybody else, but that's how they all are. But being able to make suggestions that people can apply to their own circumstances is hugely helpful. But to do that, you do need people who are technical enough to, which totally exists. Lots of companies have documentation teams, but you need people who are technical enough to understand the framework, the language, et cetera, and also how to talk to multiple people at the same time without necessarily boring the experts or the people who wrote it, and without alienating the noobs or the people who need to understand it out of necessity. So, but it's hard.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask, and I think this may collide with some of the stuff y'all were whiteboarding outside before we all got in here, but kind of what if you know Crumm, or if it's even like decided on yet, kind of what is LiveView's kind of place in kind of the framework's kind of forward-looking view around? Is it supposed to be? Let me actually ask my question. Is it supposed to be something that is like it's for backenders to be able to write dynamic front ends, or is it supposed to be something that's like we want to attract more front enders to the ecosystem and kind of make it something where we want front enders to be an advocate for doing more things in Phoenix and pulling more people into the like Elixir ecosystem kind of through the side door almost? Or is there any perspective on that at all? I don't know.
Well, that's a great question. From my own perspective, I think there is. I mean, we would like to see everyone using Phoenix, obviously, but no. In reality, though, I think that one of the goals primarily around LiveView is that when, prior to writing software in LiveView, you found yourself having to really adopt two completely different ecosystems, platforms, for things that you were doing. Like you had your back end code and you had your front end code. And I think a big portion of what LiveView was meant to do is sort of eliminate that gap so that you could work in one language almost exclusively. You could write code in one place and not have to duplicate your effort, on the other end. As an example, like one of the earliest things that I ran into that I think really sold me on LiveView was I started to build out a page again for that same contract thing, and my initial thought for the folks that we were working with, I said, you know what, let's not use LiveView. We don't need LiveView for this back end, admin page. It's a fairly simple form. It's going to list some stuff, have an input, whatever. Going to need to sort a couple of things, whatever, filter a couple of things. That's it. So I said, let's not use LiveView. And as we started to build it out, and we hadn't even gotten to the building part. We were just describing our requirements, and our requirements were going to be, the controller that rendered the HTML, and then suddenly we needed several more API endpoints, right? We needed the search endpoint. It needed to have some filter functionality. It needed to have some, some sorting functionality. It needed to have several of these other things. And as we started digging into like what we were going to need to add and how much more that was, we were going to need some, oh gosh, was this for there was some level of handling authentication that hadn't been considered yet, that we were going to need to put in place, and a couple of these other things. And it was almost immediately as we started looking through these requirements, we're like, wait a minute, why wouldn't we use LiveView? So we said, well, now, okay. So then our experiment shifted. It was like, well, let's see what it would look like. If we find that it becomes difficult, if it's going to get in our way somehow, we'll stop and we'll go back to what we were going to do, because we knew what that was going to look like to build it as an API. And it was like 40 lines of code. Like we wrote 40 lines of code to have full-blown search, sortable, filterable search page for whatever this thing was. And when I think about what the difference between that and what it would have taken to implement all of those API endpoints, all of the, whatever additional authentication checks we were going to need to do, token, refreshes and whatever, it felt a little bit absurd that it would, that you would even go to that level. So the amount of things that you can do with much smaller amounts of code is pretty wild. And that's just been my experience kind of across the board with Elixir. Is like the amount of things I could do was so much larger than like the work that I was putting into it.
And I think that's going to be true for like both, for multiple sets of audiences, right? So like you've got your backend developers who, I mean, the backends, the front ends that I make are still don't look good, but in terms of functionality, right? You could build something simple, but then there would be these cliffs of complexity where you're having to take on you can pick maybe one of the really lean JavaScript tooling sets and avoid the entire build systems you have to bring in for some of the other more complicated ones. But even still, how is it getting data? How is it parsing data? You start ending up with a bunch of duplicate representations because now you have you need your serializers and you need your deserializers, and it becomes this entire stack of stuff you have to set up. When
routing
right.
almost invariably gets duplicated.
Yeah, and so you have like the backenders suddenly get to just like get a much smoother, more incremental slope of difficulty, where like as they do more difficult stuff, they might still have to write some things, but they don't hit suddenly these huge cliffs. And I think on the front end side as well, they if you are coming from just like the JavaScript world, you cannot really influence the backend stack quite so much, or maybe you're doing a full JavaScript backend, but you still have many of that same code duplication problems, or those whole tools to try to dedupe that stuff, or code gen it for you, or whatever else. But you have what I've heard most commonly from them is they got such a more sane state story switching from JavaScript over to LiveView, and this kind of gets almost back to Sarah's point around like danger of messing with things. Yeah. The lack of mutable state means that like if you have a particular assign and you want to do some transformation to it in a little component to go visualize it, there is no props or this or whatever that you can like accidentally pollute and set some value and like you've borked some other part of the page. You don't have a Redux cache.
Many
that
fewer
is,
rakes to walk.
Yes, that's exactly right.
Yes.
And if there is something that doesn't seem to be working right, you can just dump the state, the socket assigns to the console, and you have like a perfect snapshot of what is occurring. It's the entire state of that process. That story, I think, has been transformative. And I was just writing a brand new LiveView app from scratch for a project, and it was my first time using the new components syntax and the new like tooling around defining the inputs to components. And I think it's going to go a long way. You said like 50% of the stack traces are good and like 50% of them are not always the most helpful.
Yeah.
That tooling was huge on that front because you can now say like, oh, this component requires that you have these things, or this, and here's like the types of those things. And it's
Right.
that kind of stuff made it so much easier to use, misuse, and then correct like the components in the app. And as the editor support's also getting better and better for that, I think that's going to be kind of a game changer from like a developer experience standpoint. But
This is another place where we sit in a really unique position as a company in that since we did start at 0.1 on the LiveView end of things, like folks who are jumping in today get to run the phoenix.new command and get this brand new, fresh, nice greenfield application space to work in with these super cool components that have been built for them with a lot of thought into all kinds of different things, accessibility and what have you. And everybody who started about the time we did gets to upgrade their app into that nice, reality. So I'm looking forward to the as Sara and I can actually spend some time doing that and figure out what we want our component story to look like in Phoenix. But yeah, it's definitely, that's all very new and still kind of coming into being. I think there's room still to grow. It is much nicer. It's much easier to read. The trick will be the same as what it is on the React side, is that, I don't want to end up in the component itis where we've got, 17 one-liner, two-liner, three-liner components or whatever doing all kinds of weird things.
But this
keeping
this isn't a philosophical episode.
right. So yeah, but that's the stuff as we move more into those kind of paradigms that have we've already seen success in that area. I mean, whether it's web component slots or the stuff that React does with just that component architecture, like that obviously has value in being able to act more. What am I really trying to say? It reads a lot nicer for one. Like it certainly makes it much easier to kind of read down the page and understand, hierarchically sort of what's being rendered, which is always nice.
On the componentitis thing, though, I think that is also where like the language has our back, and there seems like there's this LiveView is doing a good job of getting mileage out of the language and the VM, I guess you could say, because when they say stateless component, like they mean it. Like you flat can't make it hold state.
There's no asterisk there.
There is no, and with change tracking and some other stuff, like having a functional component when it's functional in like the technical sense of that term. It has some set of pure inputs and you get a pure output, and that makes, I think, there's still some thought about what you want to break into components, but like if you want to have a button component or a text input component or whatever, those should be functional components. They should not be stateful. But you can, like, when you talk about reading things, right? Like when you can go to there's a lot of stuff you kind of need on an input or on a certain display to make sure that the screen readers are happy with it and that it will, et cetera, et cetera. But like those are a little boilerplatey, and it makes it really easy to have a component worry about that stuff. The slots and attributes mechanic now, make sure you give it everything it needs, so it can't be invalid. It'll take care of itself. But then when you're looking at your form, you're like, yes, this has like the 5 things I need to make sure that people give me, and you have less of that boilerplate. And that was certainly my experience on the new app. Our production app, it depends on where you look, which epoch of LiveView you're getting.
Poor Mike. He's like a core team member, and now he's responsible. Okay, there's 700 leaks files. We need you to update them to leaks files. The syntax is different. You can't just generate that code.
Fun.
Just want
You know,
to
but
shout out to you.
we're making.
We just
Well,
do it
thank
in
you, Billy.
little chunks.
We are making, yes, we are making our way. Unfortunately, yeah, no hard deprecations in any of those things. So, you know, it still does the thing. I only ran into one weirdness there where I converted something. What was it? I converted a
interpolated
I
IDs,
thought-
right? That was the issue.
Well, no, I was thinking of the one where I had refactored the template, but I hadn't actually renamed the file. And so since leaks is still, I mean, it all ends up as HTML once it hits the browser, right? And the nice thing about the new engine is that it sort of understands some HTML semantics, so it can let you do more cool things. But that also means that now we have these components that look like elements. They just look like tags. The weird part about that is depending on like how it's named. So if you had one that was, it was just a component alias or whatever, so it's like capital letter, for the first character of the element, and you're and you forget to rename your file, so you have a leaks file and you ship that to the browser. Well, the browser just thinks that's an HTML tag. So like if you didn't do anything, if it didn't have any like interpolated attributes or anything else, it doesn't. It compiles just fine, and then the browser gets it, and it's like, oh, okay, you just don't understand, and so it lowercases everything, and it just doesn't render, because it's like, I don't know what it was our blank slate component, so it was like, I don't know what components.blank slate is, so it just gave me that tag, it showed up in the DOM. In the DOM, but it wasn't rendering, so like the page was blank, as opposed to, showing the blank state, but those
Instead
are just, that's a little thing. Right, yeah, exactly. So... But that was, I mean, that's a easy little oversight, and there's not a lot, can be done about that sort of thing. But which I think just speaks even more to the niceties of the new engine, which is like, well, it'll tell you if you do things wrong and if it doesn't know what you're talking about.
Sure.
And for all the grief for all the sort of, I guess, belly aching about some of the LiveView changes, they have done a remarkably good job minimizing hard deprecations. And like we've had. By far the hardest era was sort of like 0.1 to 0.4 or 5, somewhere in there where Chris, I mean, what do you expect, right? It's darn near alpha software, and Chris is sort of like wholly reconsidering giant parts of it. But for quite a while now, last 2 years, I would say, each upgrade has just been like, okay, tweak a couple of these things, and we haven't, even though these like new features have come out, it's a new engine. You can still run the old engine, both produce IO data, both go over the wire just fine. Like you can kind of, it's not been a super grueling thing where you're having to just like, okay, we're going to spend 3 weeks editing 700 files. So
the move towards components, I think folks may have hit a few like deprecation things that may have been confused. Like I'll admit, even I was unsure when I hit one. I was like, oh no, do I need to upgrade more than I need to upgrade? And the truth was, no, I probably didn't need to, but it definitely sort of, can spur you to want to move in that direction.
Yeah.
So if you have a lot of pages, I mean, you definitely got to take a little bit of time. Between like 16, 17, 18, there was it wasn't near as bad as it was back in the day, but yes, there was a little of like, okay, I need to sit down and figure out kind of where I'm at and what I'm using, and decide what I want to change. But even, I mean, that said, we still have pages. We're on 0. I don't know if I got to 19. I think I'm on 0.18.
Yeah.
No. We're on one of the two, and we still have leaks pages in production. Some of them are heavily trafficked, some of them are very complicated. So it all still runs, right? It's not. Are they doing the absolute minimum diffing possible for those pages? No, they aren't. Does it matter at all? No, I also don't think it does. And so we're like, it's not super scary. I was more concerned like when Phoenix 1.7 dropped and everything. I was like, oh no, this is going to be a big old deal to do all the things, and it actually was. It was rather straightforward, and I was able to do it in like 2 pieces. So
as a company, we're also pretty fond of GraphQL. I believe there was a book written, right?
That's what that's what they tell me.
That's it happened, I think, right? So how does our activity in that whole sphere interact with everything that we've been talking about so far?
Yeah, we're probably we're like the only group that I know of that does this. But we've been talking about the dedicated front end. We have an Elixir app that is basically a dedicated front end. It is a client to our GraphQL API, and it does LiveView. And it was started as a matter of just pragmatism. We have had this giant GraphQL API, and we knew that LiveView was evolving, and I just wasn't comfortable wiring up this very alpha level software into our core database servers that were data application servers rather that were powering these other APIs. And so I was like, all right, we'll just make it a GraphQL client. And it has while we've missed, I think, some of the ergonomics that come with having it be a single stack, and I'll talk about that more in a minute. Spoiler, it has to do with forms, because it always has to do with forms. There have been some upsides. I mean, for one, you still get kind of like some of the perks of GraphQL. We have mobile clients. We have mobile apps we've written in Flutter usually, and they consume the same GraphQL API, and we have a high degree of confidence. We almost never have to do special work for the mobile team, because if they're doing stuff that we can do on the web, to do it on the web, our API had to make it available, and so it's just there for them. That continues to be relevant. Subscriptions with LiveView were basically magic. It was incredible. So we had so without getting into the weeds on GraphQL, you have various kinds of GraphQL documents that you can submit to a server, a basic query, ask for some data, and you get it back. And a subscription says, hey, when certain events happen, please send this to me. And so we had a query to look at pull the data to go look at a shipment. And we had that working on it, iterated on that for a few weeks. And then I was like, okay, let's make this live. Let's see what happens. And so we already had GraphQL subscriptions working. We have an internal event system. And so you could submit a GraphQL subscription to the server using traditionally any of the JavaScript kind of clients. And when those events would fire, you would get that document back. And so I just picked a random WebSocket library off Hex and connected to the server and threw a subscription over there. And I asked for all the same fields that I did when I did the initial query. And you can use a fragment to make sure that's exactly the same. And so I loaded the page, got the data, did the subscription, and when I get an event message, I just took those contents, replaced the state on the assign, and re-rendered. That was it. That was all I did, and it just worked. And that's literally, it's still that way. That's all we do.
Yeah.
And it couldn't be easier. And I think that that's still an area, frankly, where doing GraphQL is better, more well specified, I guess you could say, than doing the full stack LiveView, because you see people, and I think some of the books kind of have you do a pub sub thing, but you immediately run into the normal data loading problem and trying to figure out if that's efficient and blah blah blah. You're just kind of making up your own little conventions, and that's not bad. And we there's a million little tooling things around being a GraphQL client that I kind of wish were better. Wish I had time to work on, but that side of it was super fun.
We even get bonus points for the amount that we send over the wire to render that change. We're only just because of the nature of LiveView, we only send the things for a shipment that changed. It would be the most recent data timestamp change. That is all you send over the wire to change that page.
Oh yeah, that diffing is cool. So because we've got it's the same. So we use Kubernetes, but it doesn't really matter about that. It's just we have our cloud environment, and so you've got your database server, or your application servers. Eventually, I'll get that right. Application servers, and you've got our front end servers, and they are in the same availability zone. They're right next to each other, and so it costs nothing, and it's very efficient for them to send data. So we ask for a bunch of stuff, we get a bunch of stuff back that gets rendered in LiveView, and then to your point, only those things that are actually different for that client actually go across the wire, and it makes that super efficient.
For free.
For free, yeah. We no work was done here.
No. Kind of incredible.
Yeah, the subscription stuff really does kind of take it to another level, because then your soft real-time updates use the same functionality as taking user input from form data or whatever. Like it's literally the same paradigm, it's the same programming concept. It applies the whole way through. And that is my other favorite thing about Elixir, is that everything's the same even when it's different. The programming model works all the way through. LiveView, Jason Stebbs is another member of the Phoenix core team, just wrote an article on the fly.io Phoenix blog about, LiveView is just a process, right? It's another, each LiveView connection, each user's connection to the server is a single LiveView process. It doesn't share anything with any other LiveView process. And that is a process the same as any other, Elixir process. And when you understand the semantics of those things, and I actually think LiveView is a really good way to sort of get some insight into how that process structure works and what it is to have state within, an immutable or essentially stateless kind of language, or functional language. So you can learn some of those things. You can start building a Phoenix app with LiveView and start learning some of those conventions for what is a handle event. A handle event is really just an extension of like a handle info. And you say, what is a handle info? And then when you find out that there's another thing called a gen server, and that's really can be for doing just about anything. And it also can have a handle info, and it's all kind of the same. And I find that to be very cool, because your knowledge grows and it goes with you when you go into these other areas. Yeah,
that's an area. Yeah, you will learn things just by osmosis, just doing regular stuff in doing LiveView that are absolutely applicable across the language. And I think that's actually something where Phoenix is very unusual in the framework universe, because I think frameworks are kind of notorious for all of their special little things. And so and it's easy to poke fun at Rails for this, but I also do it because it's the one I know the most beyond Phoenix. It was many years into my life as a Rails dev when I realized how many methods on like an array or a string or a number that Rails had added that were not part of Ruby. And it was I was like writing a raw Ruby app and expecting stuff to be there. And it's like, no, that's active support that added all that stuff. And magic. Yeah. And even beyond that, just the pieces of architecture, right? Like a controller, right? Is just this. It's a framework. It's a cross language, but it's a framework, a concept. And in a weird way, LiveView takes a LiveView process is a whole lot more like other regular Erlang and Elixir ideas and structures than even like a controller, because I mean a controller is kind of just a function, but a LiveView process is a gen server, which is like Erlang's famous thing that gives you like a well-behaved process. It's sort of its famous most famous little vignette of what it can do. And LiveView puts that you like front and center, using that in a really hands-on way that hooks up to a web browser and is fun and ergonomic and to use. And I just think that's really neat as a teaching tool.
Yeah, 100%. I think I may be one of the few people who does a lot of, who got heavy into doing Phoenix stuff that didn't come from a Rails background. So it's, it's kind of interesting to hit it from, to come in through a different door there as well, because I did a lot. I worked in PHP for over a decade, and
Let's go.
all the frameworks, all the things. I got deep into that side of the world, and so it was very different. Like I had a hard time with Rails. Like I'd done a little bit of Ruby stuff. I've written an app in Sinatra. But like, I think I ran Rails G or whatever, like one time, and whatever the thing was. And I was just like, I don't know what's happening. And
I feel that.
And I didn't care to learn, was kind of where I was at too. I was like, I don't want this. This seems wrong somehow. So I just never really got into it. But then like when Phoenix though, and I could see the Rails influences in certain places. I could see kind of the vague structure of it. But it wasn't off-putting in any kind of way, like when I started looking at that. But again, like I came in with, I've been doing web development since like what, 01, right? 98, if we're being real honest. So like, you know, I had done the HTML, I had made the thing, I had done a lot of work in an MVC kind of architecture. So that stuff, I mean, those things become fairly familiar. You know, you get into sort of pattern recognition kind of thing when you're, you know, regardless of what framework. Like I go pick up Python has like Flask, or, you know, again, like I mentioned Sinatra, stuff, some of these small things, they all still follow those same conventions, right? Here's a route, here's a controller, and, you know, go do your thing. So that stuff was felt very straightforward. One of the things I liked about Phoenix was that I felt like it wasn't magic, right? There was very little magic. And when I understood, and it was easy to find as well. Like the thing that confused me the most, or was probably the most, took a second for my head to understand what was going on, was just like when you generate a Phoenix app and you go into a controller, you have something that says use, you know, whatever you named your app, and then it, comma, controller. And so, okay, well, that tells you it's a controller, but I didn't fully grok what was happening like behind that statement. If you dig into there, it's, oh, something's being included in this module that I've created, and that thing is actually mine, and I have control over it, but it's conventional that it looks like this and it has these pieces in it. And where all those bits and pieces came together. But it was, once you could kind of see it, and if you were pointed in the right direction, it was easy to find, which I never found to be true. I would ask people who did deep into Rails things, and I would ask them the same kind of questions. They'd be like, well, because it was not going to be a straightforward answer. So I like that about it, and I really liked, and I would say for a long time, that the thing I like most about Phoenix is that there's no magic in it. I can't say that about LiveView, because it's just there's just enough extra going on that it does feel like magic. And arguably, no, it's not magic, and you could point at the thing and where it happens, but there's a lot of things that you have to point at to get all the way from like A to Z.
Would you say that magic, how much of that magic lives on the client and how much of that lives in the server? Because, and I ask,
I think the
like,
fact that there is a client makes there, like, it just feels magical. Like what is happening on the client, right? Yeah. But there's a couple of things. There's the diffing engine that, you know, that everything is running through. So like the code you write and like what actually comes out the other end, and you have this rendered struct and it has stuff in it. Like Alex Garibay, another member of the core team, he gave a talk on it quite a ways back, and all of it's still completely relevant, right? Like that talk's probably 5 years old, but that's still how the diffing engine works, I think, for the most part. So it comes over the wire as pieces like statics, dynamics, and a couple of other things. And so, yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it is that, yes, there's a client, and the client's going to put together, it's going to reconstruct the universe. Sometimes I think of it like Willy Wonka and like Mike TV, as he goes over the, you know what I'm talking about?
Yep.
Maybe it's too, but like he gets turned into, Sarah knows what I'm talking about. Thank you, Sarah.
We got it.
Yeah, but like, well, yeah, Mike TV from Willy Wonka, he goes in, he wants the candy bar, but the candy bar gets Wonka vision, turns the candy bar into a bunch of pieces, and then it ends up over on the other side. And that's kind of how LiveView works. It takes your code apart and it turns it into a bunch of million little pieces, and it sends it over to the client and puts it back together. And it can get a little weird when it does that, because also, like, I mean, everything is a lie. Is the other thing, right? Whether it's React that we're talking about or whatever, right? Like the VDOM is a lie. How all of that comes together and like what's actually happening. Everything is lying to you. It's the same. So, you know, we use a thing. LiveView uses a tool called MorphDOM under the hood on the client side that takes whatever we send over, and then it runs through a series of transformations to like put that stuff back in place and do the thing. And so all of that's a lie. And, you know, whatever comes out the other end, like you hope that it does the right thing, but there are a bunch of quirks and little idiosyncrasies that you're going to run into regardless of what you're working in. So we just try to remove as many of those as possible, so that they don't bother people. And for the most part, they don't, because like Ben can go and build a new app and he's not bothered by any of this at all.
Well, because that's and that's maybe the bias. The bias is the back end, as a back end developer at heart, showing of like the Elixir side of it is arguably like one of the more Elixir native or Erlang native kind of ways of doing the web, I feel like, than even traditional request response. And it is not that many clicks to get from your LiveView code, the module that is that LiveView process, into the underlying gen server that Phoenix wrote to like handle that stuff. And it is not that complicated. It's just a pretty normal thing. But everything from like, okay, it's ready to go to the client, all the way to whatever the stuff happening on the client, and then it trying to send stuff back to the server. Yeah, I don't think about that. And that usually works for me, which I think is a testament to the labor review and others. But yeah, I'm sure that's real fun.
Yeah, I am used to... Go ahead.
Please, Billy, go.
I was going to say, I am used to being able to drop like an IO inspect anywhere inside of what I'm working and see it. And there is, of course, a magic transformation, spooky action at a distance, and suddenly I have something on my page. And that is a little bit different to work in. But yeah, I generally don't have to think about it, which is nice. Also, tiny tangent. Mike got me on DBG finally. I just wasn't using it for no good reason.
Oh, the
It's
new
down.
macro in Elixir?
It's literally a drop-in replacement for IO inspect, and I just wasn't using it. He was like, we were on a call, and he's like, Billy, why are you still? You don't need to label your prints anymore. Just use DBG, and it'll like print the line number and like the rest. It's magical. Sorry. Anyway.
Yeah, he had a little revelation there. It was really nice. It was entirely because he's like, I gotta go add some labels, and I was like, no, you don't. Stop using IO inspect. And it's great. There's one little downside. I think as soon as Elixir 1.15 drops, I will not have to mention it anymore, and we can all just use DBG, and our lives will all be demonstrably improved. But if you're running IEX, if you're running your Phoenix server, whatever, through IEX, and you're using anything less than 1.15, which is not released yet, Elixir 1.15, you probably want to pass the no pry flag to IEX, which is like, so there's a thing called pry, and it lets you sort of like drop into the environment that whatever your request is running in, so you can kind of see what's going on there or whatever. But the practical the actual reality of that when you're talking about a web app is that you try and make a request in the browser, and then your console sitting there going like, do you want to pry this? And it's just, you think the browser's hung, but it's really just waiting for your input in this other place, and then you have to remember to go and press yes. And
Wait, so
if you wait long enough, and it crashes.
Does DBG pry by default?
Yes, don't ask me how all the pieces connect there, but under IEX, when you DBG, it will invoke pry unless you pass the no pry flag. But I think everyone decided that this was a mistake, and so 1.15 will reverse the behavior. So like you would need to. I don't know if that'll mean you'd pass the pry flag instead. It probably will mean that, but yeah, it's going to change. I think I haven't went and tested it yet, but that's one, and because we have just how we have our setup going, like it makes it a little harder to do in Canopy. So like in our front end app, I haven't been promoting DBG as heavily at the moment, but eventually we will, because it is great, and it's it has superpowers that I haven't had a chance to totally explore yet. But I'm actually curious to see. I have a little experiment that I was playing with to be able to use DBG to do a thing that we use. So back in the day in PHP land, right, there's a super great function called var dump, right? And so you say var dump, and it's basically like inspect, but you would just var dump. And the cool thing is that like frameworks would sort of, and I don't know exactly how this worked because I never got really into like internals and PHP stuff, but they would do a thing to where, sure, probably not. They would do a thing to where var dump kind of like got overridden somehow, because magic, and then it would like print. It would pretty print in the browser, so you could var dump a variable or whatever in the middle of your page, and it would print like with pre-tags or whatever, and it would actually look like code, and it was super handy to do, because everybody does IO puts debugging, right? Like that is the thing. So this is that, but for the web, and it's fantastic. So DBG is capable of doing that, and I have a little experiment where I have a sort of a junky version of it. Like it works, but it's not very nice looking. And so I want to sort of get that out there in the world, and we can all go back to we can do DBG in our live views and see nice things on the page. Nice. And cool. Yeah, that'll be fun.
Well, I feel like that's a pretty decent place to leave things for this one. That top tip. Y'all did awesome. Like, way to go. Yeah.
Thank you, Chris.
Fantastic.
Thank you, Crumm. No, this was fun.
I'm seeing this.
Is this like the first show for anybody ever? Yeah. First podcast, Crumm?
No. I've been invited on several.
Wow.
Ooh.
I'm kidding.
We're not saying this, Mike.
Veteran.
I've done one or two.
Cool. Well, thanks y'all. I appreciate it. It's been great. We'll do it again next summit. Yeah.
Sweet.
All right.
Sounds great.
Yeah.
Thanks, dude.
Thanks, Chris.
All right.
Nice to see y'all.
Us.
See ya.
Take Crumm.
See ya.
Bye bye.